Welcome to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Welcome to the Talent Optimization Podcast. This week, we are talking about policy impacts on culture. I know, oh joy, right? My name is Tracy Shirk, and I'm the Chief Talent Officer here at Elevated Talent Consulting. And I have Dan Kopp with me today. And Dan is going to tell us a little bit about himself, and then we're going to jump into compensation as we continue the conversation that we had with Aaron last week. So Dan, tell us a little bit more about you.
Well, before I get into that, I just want to encourage your listeners to listen through to the whole show, because I know they're going to get some takeaways today that they'll find valuable. So after a career in the Army and a career in public education, I got into private business about 4 years ago, and my partner and I created algorithms that help our clients align compensation with employee value, and it's been a game changer for our clients. And our goal is to help leaders of organizations positively impact their organizations, and that's what we're seeing happening.
I love it, because so often I look at algorithms and I go, that's above my pay grade, and my brain does not work that way. And it's so needed to ensure that not just fairness in what we're doing, but that there's transparency, that individuals know, hey, what's here.
Absolutely. With many laws that are coming across the country right now, whether it's city or state level laws, where pay transparency is mandated to include a job posting, you've got to put the pay range in a job posting. We argue that you should take that one step further and put your pay philosophy in it, because it's one thing to say starting at $50,000, ending at 75, but if nobody knows how to get to 75 or what's required to get there, it's sort of pointless. So we encourage our clients to advertise how they get to the top of the pay scale. And it's been a game changer, like I said, and our clients are loving the process.
Yeah. And we're a part of so many groups, and we had a Vistage listserv yesterday that was, specifically saying, hey, how do you build a skill-based pay compensation system? And I'm like, well, I don't know, but I've got a guy for that. So how do you do that? So if there's certain skills that's going to get you from 50 to 75, what is it?
Well, we always start with a philosophical question, and I have people in front of me say, close your eyes and picture an ideal client. It could be somebody with whom you work now, somebody with whom you've worked in the past, could be the person you see in the mirror every morning. And think about the skills, the attributes, the abilities, the degrees, the certifications that go into making that person in your mind great. Then ask yourself this simple question: does their compensation system recognize those great things that you just identified? Odds are pretty good they don't. And if you can quantify it, we would argue it should be put in a compensation system. We call those things pay differential variables. And if it's important to the organization and your people are delivering on those things, you should pay them for those things.
So thank you for explaining your big words here, Dan. So those pay differential variables are incredibly important. And I'm going to tie this for our listeners. We've talked a lot about talent pathways. And, a talent pathway is essentially, hey, I am going to move from position A to position B. But within that move from position A to position B, I'm gaining skills. I'm gaining experiences. I'm gaining very specific, it could be certifications. And so, what we're talking about is essentially stating for each of those levels and in-role growth, we're putting a comp on top of it so that we can elevate. And that allows organizations and individuals to reward. Again, it's extrinsically versus intrinsically, and we want to make sure that we have those two rewards there. Extrinsically means, hey, it's coming from the outside, whereas intrinsically is like, oh my gosh, I just accomplished this certification. I'm so excited about it. What else do you want to add to that?
You hit the nail on the head, quite honestly, because if it's important to an organization, they should put their money where their mouth is, in essence. And If a certain certification or an ability or a degree is important and they see growth and they see value for those employees to have those things, they should give them the extrinsic motivation to get them. It's a carrot and the stick. Give them the carrot. Put it out there. We want you to be able to do X, Y, and Z. If you deliver on that, we're going to pay you for it. It would be a good situation to have for all your employees to be at the top of every single pay scale, because conceptually we build them based on what we define as excellence. And could you imagine an organization that had self-defined excellence in every position coming from every individual? I mean, that'd be a good problem to have.
Right. We talk a lot about the have to curve versus the want to curve, right? So how engaged are employees? Or are they at the have to curve where they're doing the bare minimum? Or are they at the want to curve where they've got both the intrinsic, they want to do the thing and they're kind of going the extra mile. They're excited about the conversations they're having. They're excited about the work they're doing, and they're being compensated for it when they do it. That's a win-win all the way around. And one thing I just want to add is compensation's not everything, right? However, it is a really important thing. And it's one of those items that can, really, really, really quickly move somebody down to the one or to the have to curve.
Oh, absolutely. There's so many traditional systems out there. Most traditional systems are based 100% on longevity. So picture a 15-year veteran who may be at or near the top of a salary schedule. What's the impetus to be even good at your job, let alone exemplary? Because let's face it, the bandwidth of the first line supervisor might be such that they can focus on maybe the bottom 5% of performers. So if you're not in the bottom 5%, you've got to basically a get out of jail free card to do whatever you want. And there's no impetus to even be good at your job. You just don't have to be terrible.
Right.
So with our system, we identify things that our clients identify things that matter to them, and then their employees have the ability to decide whether or not to deliver on them. And most people aren't going to sit on their laurels when they've got the opportunity to go out and get a raise by merely being satisfactory at their job or getting that extra certification. Or maybe we're talking, I had a conversation with somebody in manufacturing the day. We were talking about CNC operators. So maybe they wanted to encourage, this particular employer wanted to encourage people on the floor to get cross-trained to be fill-in CNC operators. Well, there's obviously value for that for the employer, because they're not going to stop production when their main operator is down. But there's also, we could put value on that as the other person who's not the normal operator. All of a sudden they're getting a pay differential because they've got that cross-training under their belt. So it's a win-win from the employer and the employee, because
right.
Employees grow, the employer rewards that because they know it's what's going to help the organization.
Right. And I want to touch on for a second, in smaller organizations or flat organizations, there's not a huge ladder, right? And so often we're focusing on in-role growth. And what does in-role growth look like? And I know I mentioned this at the beginning, but I'm bringing it up again because it's so incredibly important, is if you're listening and you find yourself in that, in-role growth with wage attached to it is a key way to retain some of your best employees that so often otherwise they're going to leave. And that's why we have these talent pathway plans that lay out the different steps within in-role growth, especially for small employers. Otherwise, again, you lose your best employees and you're like, hey, why are you leaving? And they're like, well, I wanted development opportunities and you don't offer it because there's not another position, or this person's going to be here for the next 20 years. I don't see any room to grow. Well, guess what? It's on you to communicate the growth opportunities that are available and how that compensation and some of that intrinsic kind of motivation can come from it.
Absolutely. We've seen that a lot, especially in a small organization where you might have, for lack of a better term, team leads. And typically it's the veteran who's the team leader. And it might be a 15, 20-year veteran, but everybody knows that 15 or 20-year veteran might be around for 10 or 15 years, additional years. So there is no opportunity to get that one team leader position. So what our systems could allow for employers to do is to recognize excellence and growth within the career field without having the moniker of team leader. For example, I did a model for a firm that employed architects a while ago, and a standard entry-level architect has a bachelor's degree in some type of design field, right? They've got a degree, but there's growth apparent in people who have a master's degree. So theoretically, you could become a master architect without ever reaching that team leader status because you've grown within your field. So you could have two systems in place for your architects that recognize, well, this is the leadership path, and it culminates at the team leader, but here's the expert architect, and it culminates as our self-defined designated expert architect. However the employer would define that. We've got a nonprofit. They've got nurses. They've done the same thing. As their nurses enhance their skill set, they're rewarding them for them.
Yeah. And that's where your talent pathway plans come in, right? Because your talent pathway plans, which is exactly what you're talking about. I'm just using a different language, Dan, but our audience has heard me talk about this for the last however many episodes. Is you have that leadership track, but then you also have the expert or the specialist track. And then the third track we talk about is we have our happy alumni track for those who just want to move out of the organization, which we're not necessarily talking about today. Do you like my pathways here?
I do. And I appreciate that because we've seen that come to life, because in our process, our partner clients, they, in essence, go through a values exercise, and then they wear their values on their sleeve, if you will, and they put them in their compensation systems. And I was actually in the room once when the same nonprofit I mentioned a minute ago, they built one for their nurses, and they did a great job. First line supervisors, executive director, and nurses in that job category got together along with me. I facilitated it. We discussed what makes good nursing. After a 6-week long process, it wasn't like one 6-week long meeting. We went several times over 6 weeks. An hour here, an hour there. The lead nurse said, love the process, love what we created. I just realized I don't fit this organization. So I'm going to take my 25 years of experience, go find some place that I fit. And then that organization went to market and say, hey, here's what we value. We've identified our values, and more importantly, we've put them in our compensation system. They've drawn in people who fit them, and they're all going in the same direction now because everybody fits their organization. So an example of how this could work in an organization, we've got a nonprofit organization that, and I use that term loosely because when they started with us 3 years ago, they had $5 million equity in their organization, and fast forward 2+ years and they grew that to $19 million. And their executive director attributes 100% of their success and growth to the fact that they're using Dinamico because they've articulated their values. He meets with every new employee. First of all, he attracts people who fit them. He then meets with the employee and articulates what it takes to get to the top of a pay scale. And every single individual employee knows where his or her position fits within the greater organizational structure, and they all know where the organization's going. And he professes he would not have that if he didn't have this tool that allowed him to articulate what they actually value.
And that's amazing. And I love the fact that this can articulate it. What you just reminded me of is the Patrick Lencioni, book where it's humble, hungry, and smart. So it's the ideal team player, right? Correct. Is when you can define those things. And so often you do not see organizations build that into the comp structure and build that into their performance management. And that's what dilutes, the organization. We so often talk about this when we're, training on predictive index, which is, we call it heart. Like, what is the heart, the organizational values? And is that a match for the individual values of the person coming in? Because if there's not a culture fit, you are going to have huge issues inside of the organization.
Absolutely. And getting back to your extrinsic versus intrinsic statement, even if someone doesn't necessarily align, value by value, and they're not perfectly aligned, but they're practicing as a professional in the organization as if they were, and they're, for lack of a better term, playing the game and delivering on what the organization wants, that's still a win because they're delivering things that bring value to the organization.
Correct. And, there are times where you step into an organization not even realizing you're not a great culture fit, but yet you do it for a period of time while you're learning. And then it's going, okay, now it's time to leave. Now, what I want to stress here, though, is that those conversations with your leadership team are so important. And that's on your leaders to create the container for every employee to be fulfilled in their work and meet the business outcomes,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One thing that I want to shift to here for a minute is, with compensation systems, one of the things that I know you do is you help employers encourage and reward satisfactory and exemplary performance, which we've talked about. But it's also ensuring that they have equitable compensation practices. So, last week, if you listened to the podcast, you heard Aaron and I chat about all of the legal items that come up with compensation. And there are a lot of them. And we've seen so many situations where, there is pay disparity happening because there wasn't a system in place. And when we have transparency inside of our systems and we're sharing that with our staff, you can elevate so much higher and so much faster. So I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about equitable compensation and kind of how you've solved that problem?
Sure. I would argue it's probably the most important thing that our system does because it takes the subjective guesswork out of all compensation discussions. I was actually involved in a discussion via LinkedIn about 6 months ago with a colleague in regard to his post was something like, don't you just love it when you ask somebody how much they want for a salary and then you tell them, oh, you're undervaluing yourself. I'm actually going to give you $10,000 more. I said, pump the brakes, dude. That is not a good way to approach this. This guy happened to be a DEI expert. I said, when you do that to somebody, a person of color, a female, somebody in an underrepresented group, you are assuming they've never been discriminated against before, or you're assuming they haven't got a skewed sense of value based on society's view of them. So I said, your system should objectively dictate how much a new hire is worth. If your starting salary is 50, but perhaps you've got, like I mentioned, the master's degree earlier, and that's worth X number of dollars in addition to the base salary of 50,000, then you identify that coming in the door and you put that person at the appropriate pay level. The second you don't have a consistent compensation system, you open yourself up to liability and discrimination complaints. Our system is not arbitrary. Everything's calculated, it's targeted, and it allows for consistent compensation decisions. Because again, the second you stray from that, and the second you're inconsistent, the second you make an arbitrary decision, then you've opened yourself up. And oftentimes what we're seeing, especially in some public sectors, decisions were made 10, 15 years ago that all of a sudden the leaders in place now are different than the people who made that decision 15 years ago. But the people in place now are the ones left holding the bag, having to justify why is there pay disparity on these two similarly situated employees 15 years down the road. One happens to be female, one happens to be male.
We're not talking about Lily Ledbetter at all, are we?
Generic discussions. That's all we're having.
Right.
So it's imperative to have an objective tool.
Right. So, and I bring up Lily Ledbetter because we talked about it last week. So if you're not familiar with the Lily Ledbetter case, it essentially was a case where it changed the law to say, hey, even if a pay decision was made 15 years ago, that there was a differentiation between male and female or race or whatever, every time a new paycheck is issued, it starts the clock again, right? And so that's why I bring it up, because that is a law. And this is something that, this type of system will help you to look at and say, okay, we understand we've got demons in our closet, but we're going to draw a line in the sand and move things forward. And if you're looking at this and you feel like you're sitting in this situation right now, I would really encourage you to listen to the podcast from last week where we do talk about how do you draw that line in the sand without kind of putting a spotlight on, hey, you can come, sue us, when you're trying to do the right thing going forward.
Absolutely. And our system would allow for longitudinal evidence, a key word in the attorney world. If you've got evidence upon which you base that discrepancy in compensation, there was a good reason for it, that'll be sufficient. But most of these arbitrary and inconsistent decisions that have been made this year or 15 years ago, there typically isn't evidence to support why the inconsistency exists.
Yep, absolutely. Awesome. So as we start to kind of land our plane here today, I'm curious, what is one takeaway that you have for the executives listening in?
You're probably wasting money right now because your systems are inefficient. If you've got higher than desired turnover, you're probably losing some good people because you're not paying them what they're worth, and they're simply going elsewhere. And if we're talking wage earners, they might be going elsewhere for 27 cents an hour. And
Right.
You're probably overpaying people who are, for lack of a better term, coasting because they've been at the top of your salary schedule. There's no impetus for them to even be satisfactory. So your inefficient systems are wasting you time and money, and it's time you can fix them. And with the benefit of that, you can ensure compensation equity, you can encourage and reward satisfactory performance. There's a lot of benefit to changing.
Awesome. And what about a takeaway for our HR folks that are listening in today?
I engage with a lot of HR people, and there's some stellar HR people out there. And what I've found is the larger the organization, the more ingrained they are into their current pay practices. And then I ask them, you may have 30 different categories. Each individual employee category is easy to manage, but when you think about managing all 30 of them, what's that look like and how's that make you feel? Most of them don't like that idea. So with our system, and you can come in and basically systemize everything you've done, and it all looks the same on one user-friendly dashboard. And it's going to be they're all going to be treated the same way, operated the same way. And that's what I encourage you to do, whether it's in Excel, because you can do this in Excel, or you contact me and you can do it with me. But you need to make your systems consistent just to make your office more efficient. And we often hear a lot of ideas that almost makes me think people are thinking, we don't have time to be more efficient. Make time, become more efficient by systemizing what you're doing so all 30 act and look the same. It will make your life easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, if you are interested in learning more about Dan, what they do, what their system does, we will have all of his information in the show notes for you so that you can follow up on that. And, one thing I just want to stress is pay has a huge impact on the culture of your organization. And I know we talked about this throughout the conversation today and last week, but that equity in pay becomes really important. And sometimes even more important is the perception, just that transparency and the perception that pay is equitable based on what an individual is doing. So with that, we want to thank you so much for being with us this week. And, in what we have talked about, of course, we go in depth in all of these items inside of our talent optimization programs. We have a whole week specifically focused on compensation in our hire program. So with that, I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and we will see you next week. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.